Welcome to episode 3 of 3 with Gray Cook. So, Brett, this is the accumulation of 3 days of us with Gray Cook. We maybe drank too much moonshine, and we were on campus of FMS, which is just awesome. We were in the studio, and the video portion is kind of cool because you get a great idea of what where the FMS Studio is and the campus and the travel video and stuff like that. So it was really cool. But our whole purpose of this talk was the abdominal wall. So we got a little bit off of it, but the abdominal wall, its functions, and I know that this is, Brett, something that you've obsessed over in the last 20 years of you being a clinician, and Gray had some great ideas on it, and it was just kind of you two riffing back and forth, which is really fun for me.
Yeah, I think that, if you were to include everything that Gray talks about in his model, and then you're also to kind of include what we teach in the DNS as far as what the abdominal wall is doing, I think that encompasses, up until this point, the thoughts from Paul Hodges, from Stuart McGill, from Pavel Kolaj. And when we combine all those together, we basically have the right answer of what the abdominal wall is doing. You take that and you include, some of the stuff that Gray was talking about, which is basically, like, if you don't have good movement in the joints of your body, then you're not setting your abdominal wall up to be successful. So it's definitely not a binary thing. It's everything's kind of incorporated, and it's just literally like a puzzle where everything's got like a perfect fit for each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think that's the whole idea of Gestalt, right? Is Gray and Brett Winchester may look at a patient completely differently, but the hope is that they're finding their path to that same endpoint or the linchpin in the whole purpose. And so this was a really, really great episode. At the end, we kind of fangirled a little bit and, said thanks and all that good stuff. So it was just a great kind of finisher to our week with Gray, and something I'll cherish for a long time. That was a great couple days.
I don't think we could have survived one more day.
No, not a chance. Not a chance at all. Well, we're going to go heal our livers from hanging with Gray, and we hope you guys enjoyed these episodes, and let us know what you think. Subscribe to the podcast for upcoming ones. We've got some really good ones coming up, and with that being said, we'll check you next time. All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Gestalt Education Show. We're here, round 3 with Gray Cook. So if you're watching on the video, we're in the FMS Studio. We got an amazing tour of the facility, and oh man, you got to be so proud of this place. It is just really awesome. So.
We designed a work environment where we could just have more fun at work. We didn't assume we would get to work less. We didn't assume that we would get to work at a greater level of convenience. It's just way more fun.
Yeah.
And it's walking distance to the house, and there's an espresso shop at the halfway point, so it works out.
That's perfect. That is perfect.
Really good.
Well, for our last conversation, what we want to dive into is stabilization. So I feel like I'm lucky because I'm going to just kind of sit back and let you two talk a little bit about current concepts in stabilization, the abdominal wall, stability in general. And so, Brett, this has been a topic that you have been really passionate about, especially since I've known you, but basically your whole career. So do you want to kind of kick us off and ask some of the questions that I know you've been wanting to ask Gray and kind of go for it?
I think, and we've discussed this over the last 24 hours, I think what a lot of people don't understand is what the abdominal wall needs to actually do and function. And we almost have a lexicon issue because we have people saying stiffness, intra-abdominal pressure, bracing, stabilization, motor control, Kegel. You have all this verbiage, and it's leaving the world kind of confused on what's actually happening. So one concept that that we currently teach at DNS would be that you have a difference between intra-abdominal pressure and an isometric brace. And I think we all know for us to be able to, walk in a contralateral pattern or whatever it might be, I can't have a rigid isometric brace. That's just not possible. And we've all been there. I mean, early on in my career when I was teaching a brace with a patient, they'd look up to you and they'd be like, so am I supposed to do this when I'm swinging a golf club? And as a young, dumb clinician, you're like, actually, I don't even know. So then for a while, we're like, well, maybe it's less of a brace. And then what I've kind of learned over the years is there is a time in life and sport when you need an isometric brace. It's usually at the moment of contact, at the moment of hitting a ball, whatever the sport is. But up until that point, you have to have yourself stabilized in a way that's not going to lock your rib cage on your pelvis. And that's where we use the term intra-abdominal pressure, but we have an inner unit of muscles, and it basically is no different than this bottle of water. So we have our respiratory diaphragm, our pelvic floor, and we have this corset of abdominal muscles. This inner unit at any given moment in our life, we've got to be able to stabilize, we've got to be able to breathe, and we've got to be able to have continence so we don't pee and poop ourselves. This is such a fragile, delicate situation that gets compromised on, 90% of human beings, especially the ones in pain that we see in the clinic. So one thing I've learned to appreciate too is with Gray's work, how important movement of our extremities and having freely movable joints is to be able to set ourselves up to have our central nervous system be able to use these abdominal muscles. I always have a picture in one of my presentations of Andre Agassi in a pretty compromised position, but because he's got the mobility in his kinetic chain, he never has to compromise the situation between his rib cage and his pelvis. So his ability to generate the right stabilization and intra-abdominal pressure is part of the reason is he's got the movement in his extremities to be able to even get there. Whereas I may not have that ankle mobility. So at some point I've got to disrupt this situation here in my trunk. So, and Gray's got great ideas on the abdominal wall also, but I think it's almost gets glossed over how important the SFMA or the FMS even is to check to see if we have mobility in our extremities, because that is a critical component to being able to use the abdominal wall well.
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely think, and Kelly Starrett uses this term, he uses organization. Mm-hmm. And so many people look at the core and think horsepower. A good mechanic, before he ever questions horsepower, says, is the engine tuned? Because I can change your horsepower just by changing the timing of the engine. I didn't rebuild anything. You don't have new pistons or anything. There's no new metal in the car. And simply because I had an elegant adjustment of timing, we picked up 50% more horsepower. I can also take it away with the exact same adjustment. Too many people are thinking about packing on horsepower to a model, thinking muscularly, when they don't even know if it's tuned. And this probably goes back to Hodge's early work when we look at the sequence of how the abdominal wall and the core in particular, speaking 3D, the multifidus is on first, the TA is on second, and the obliques are on third. Now, if that is the way they come, if that is the sequence of an intentional movement or a reactive or perturbated movement, I honestly think that the reason the multifidus is there is not to create or generate movement. It's there to increase the tension on the guitar strings so we have position sense 3D at every joint. The TA then says, okay, well, let's get this tube of toothpaste held in your hand right, and simply creates that 3D pressure on an already kinetically connected spine. So what do the obliques do? They're the checkpoints for force stop and force generation. When I see an athlete that has been trained incorrectly or has had to play through an injury that caused pain, they adopt a thing called a high threshold strategy. And what I usually see is a lazy or weak multifidus on a multifidus test palpation. I see not real good organization of the TA, and I see a hyperactivity of the obliques. So it's almost like firing your pec before your rotator cuff. That's not a good idea. It's always better to have that rotator cuff on. It's almost like firing your glute without having your foot intrinsics on. That's not a good step. So many of us have gone to the musculature and not understood the sequence. Well, first off, the multifidus ain't going to fire first if the spine is flexed, extended, rotated, or side bent. So there has to be a neutrality, and within that neutrality, the multifidus tightens itself to be more sensitive to the next thing it needs to feel, rotation, flexion, extension, whatever. The obliques simply squeeze the situation so we're more reactive. I mean, see, the TA simply squeezes the situation. The obliques then do something about it from a directional standpoint. To get back to zero with a lot of the high-end cases I've had to work with, I've had to do some dry needling of the obliques just to shut them off so we can see what we're working with. And back to your point, then if there's an underlying mobility problem, I can have organization because I don't have proprioception. And if there's a no mobility problem, but there's an organization problem, then instead of thinking anatomically, this is the point where I think fundamentally. Well, your core looks really crappy in single leg stance and when you squat. I put you in tall kneeling and it didn't look much better. But I got you back here to prone supine rolling and I didn't really see a problem in you. But the minute we're in quadruped and kneeling, I start to see the problem. What does that say? I need to grease the groove that exists between rolling and crawling. And I think we're going to wind right back up at some of the places that we identify, rose by any other name.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
We can call it whatever we want. But when I find a dysfunctional core, I take you to a primitive pattern. And when I find a broken core, I try to identify what's broken first and what needs to be set up on the way out. Last few questions, when I have somebody that's going to get an intervention and a readjustment of the way this core is running. Complicated or difficult pregnancies. I need to know if males have had a hernia. I need to know if we've had an appendectomy or appendicitis. I need to know if we've had a C-section. I would like to ask you a few questions about your bowel, your bladder. Do you have frequent diarrhea or constipation? And if you had any major organ problems. Okay? And if you answer yes to any of those, everything we're getting ready to do is still in play, but that's more important. Meaning what the appendectomy did to the fascial layers it cut through might be a trigger that I could easily remove with some soft tissue skills. If that C-section was traumatic and painful for 6 months, but now you've forgotten about it, we got to go there. Because I can't reprogram a core with a bunch of cracks and scars and holes in it that we really haven't vetted. So if the catalyst for some of that core deterioration is typified by a pregnancy, a scar, an injury, or a visceral surgery or something like that, I want to know about it. I'm not going to do anything about it because it's the past. But it will tell me this case may have some curveballs. It may go slower. Having said that, I go right back into my core model and do it. But I put that right over here. Mm-hmm. And I think anybody getting ready to listen to what we say about a core, if they're not asking those questions, they're going to apply a general rule to a specific situation, and you cannot do that. So
right. I think too, people also are a little bit confused on eventually we need this to be subcortical and subconscious. I'm not waiting for a pitch to come and say, okay, now I have the right intra-abdominal pressure, now I can initiate my swing. So I think at some point in this journey of training our patients, we need to have their central nervous system be able to activate the system in this inner unit subconsciously and subcortically.
The way we prime that pump is I will take a move that Greg Rose has probably made more famous than me, the toe touch progression. We're going to run through a toe touch sequence, dorsiflexion bias. We're going to run through a toe touch sequence, plantar flexion bias. You can come at this from a fascial standpoint and say I'm biasing one of the anterior posterior chain. You can come at it from a neural standpoint and say I'm preloading the calf or unloading the calf. You can come at it from a vestibular standpoint and say I'm uphill, downhill. Irregardless, when we flex you, we eventually try to talk you into exhaling because you're squeezing the abdominal cavity. Why not just go ahead and dissipate all the residual air in there? But as you stand back up, we would like to think that we've pushed more out than you normally do voluntarily. By doing a squeeze move, we get a little extra air out, which means we have a little more authentic breath coming up. A lot of people wonder why we do that sequence. Returning to organized extension for somebody who doesn't do that well, how would we expect them to organize their intra-abdominal pressure? They have no concept. They're going to overshoot it or undershoot it. Mm-hmm. The one thing they're not going to do is get it right. So if I have you inhale as you come back up, and so I have you going through a movement and I call your breath, those two boards start to sand each other, right? Your wonky movement and your irregular breathing or your ineffective breathing are going to start to sing the same song to each other. And it took a bunch of scientists and exercise enthusiasts in the West to separate breath and movement. We taught yoga, Indian clubs, and martial arts for over 4,000 years and never separated a movement instruction and a breath instruction. We always told you how to breathe for this particular movement and let this particular breath hone the movement as the movement hones the breath. We get to Western culture and we do bicep curls. We just assume we will breathe adequately for that. The way we breathe in a Turkish get-up and a kettlebell swing is different. The way we breathe in a sun salutation is different than we do in conversation. So there are breath signatures that fit movement. And to your point, to turn intra-abdominal pressure into a subconscious homeostasis of whatever you're going through, that's how much intra-abdominal pressure you bring to it. If we don't have a breath sequence movement kata, how are they supposed to get there? They're not going to remember the movement. They're not going to remember the breath, but the breath and movement remember each other.
Right.
And that's how we get there.
Right. And I think, the original paper that came out in Spine in 92 by Punjabi, he was really the first person to talk about, how important movement in our joints are, the receptors in our muscles, our vision, our smell, our taste, the vestibular system, how all of these things work together. And the culminating effect with all of this is actually better motor output. So said differently, we have an obligation to our patients and our athletes and our clients to be able to make sure that all these components are in check, and all of that actually matters in their ability to stabilize their core better. And I kind of got a feeling that, when we talk about core stabilization, we kind of forget about, that part of it.
If you go through an FMS, go through our 7 movement patterns, and have a lot of difficulty, but on an orthopedic exam, you really don't have a lot of jacked up joints, it's your core. If you go through a Y balance test and don't really have a bad ankle or shoulder, but you just don't fare well, it's your core. You see what I'm saying? So all of our tests wind up saying, please vet the extremity restrictions and spinal restrictions. Please vet a lack of integrity in this joint, spondy in the back, unstable knee. We've got to vet the hinges, the alignment, and the bungee straps. We just got to vet that. But tell me you can't do that in 5 minutes. You can just go through and look for, major things. So if we've got a locked up ankle, we have an excuse for poor movement. If we don't have a locked up ankle and we still have poor movement, I think you're speaking directly to the organization and way we use our upper and lower body. Sometimes we use it in sequence. Sometimes we roll like a log. Sometimes we roll segmentally. And so the way you link your body up and the way you decide, most people who can't deep squat start their deep squat wrong. They dump their pelvis forward and descend into a squat, right? And so I can see somebody's not going to break parallel on a heels flat squat 4 inches into the squat because of the way they organize themselves. People who don't have an authentic movement pattern go through a subconscious bracing before they enter that movement pattern because it's not a place they go. So you watch somebody who doesn't lunge often, they brace for the lunge. You watch somebody who's not going to break parallel on a squat, they've pre-braced for the squat. What's stopping them from squatting? The stiff ankle, the hip arthritis, or the pre-brace? That's your job, right? They don't need to be squatting. They got an arthritic hip right now and it's really flared up. Good. They don't need to be squatting. They got a locked up ankle, but the minute we get the ankle moving, squatting is the best way to maintain that. But if your abdominal wall doesn't like this movement pattern, then how do we feed it back to your abdominal wall so it creates homeostasis? See, when we say brace, when we say tension, when we say pre-tone, any of that, the next question from the newbie is how much? Well, how much does the situation demand? And that's the elegant balance that the eyes, the ears, the touch receptors, the equilibrium, all that feed into it. Don't bring more energy to the situation than needed. That breaks the law of nature. Animals don't waste energy, right? That's why I know where to put my deer stand. The deer are going to be on that exact same trail every day because it splits the difference between safety and grade. I don't want to walk uphill, so they got the path of least resistance. So we're the only things walking around this planet that really figured out how to waste a lot of energy in a really crappy direction, and most of the time we call it exercise or random acts of resistance. If I do something for your core and it doesn't elegantly change your movement patterns in almost a subconscious way, then I don't think I've done anything for your core, even though you may know how to brace better and you can pre-tension better. If I haven't changed that authentic signature of movement, or if you're not incorporating that upgrade I gave you back into your movement, then I either got to have an on-ramp, and I'll pick some positions and patterns to foster that on-ramp, or I'm not going to take credit for doing the job.
Right. Yeah, and I think the brace, although we've talked about when it is utilized in life and sports, it's very compressive. So I mean, it could get expensive to the body, and I think you use a great term when you said using a high threshold strategy. So we need that. In DNS, when we talk intra-abdominal pressure, we often say when people understand the inner unit intra-abdominal pressure well within their body, we believe that you're actually decompressing the spine with what a great thought. So in a time when you are needing to overcompress with a or getting isometrically stiff, you have this inner unit of muscles that is actually decompressing your spine. It like nature, made it perfect that way. And I think early on when we're training our patients, a lot of times when we need intra-abdominal pressure, they'll make a mistake. They'll actually, start to incorporate a brace. And, a lot of people who've seen me talk before, I mean, we show on ultrasound, there is a clear difference between what's happening in the abdominal wall when we generate intra-abdominal pressure versus when we actually create a brace. A brace is, prepare yourself for a punch. Intra-abdominal pressure, the cue that seems to work the best is push your muscles out into my hand. When I do that, I now have freedom to still relax my extremities, the muscles in my extremity. I have freedom to separate my rib cage from my pelvis, which, we had a great discussion this morning about, being able to utilize and get stretch in our fascia and our slings. To be able to do that, I can't be braced because I can't separate my rib cage from my pelvis. But if I have the right intra-abdominal pressure, I can still keep my spine stable as I'm literally winding up tension in these anterior and posterior oblique slings. And this is the magic of rotational sports right there. Being able to utilize, get the stretch. And Gray, on our paddleboard this morning, I thought you said it so well. It's not about like stretching these slings more. I mean, that's part of it. But the next part of the story is we got to train it.
Yeah, we've got to actually embrace the elasticity that's in there. There's preloaded elasticity. And since we know about 20% of each of our muscles doesn't really interweave back into the bone, it actually goes back into that body sock, right? So every time a muscle in your body contracts, 80% of that muscle's pulling right on the bony segment that the tendon inserts on. Where's the other 20% going? Back into the tube, back into the layers, back into everything. So we treat the fascial system a lot. We don't use it too much, And so when I was showing you guys stuff with Indian clubs or something like that, it's using that tensegrity to bounce off of that little bit of a bungee. One other thing that you were saying, I often use that hands-on, those words to talk to somebody about their core. But when I'm truly trying to make that transition, because I think people go from subconscious dysfunction, I don't know what's wrong with me, but something's wrong with me. So I'm dysfunctional, but it's not at a conscious level. It's subconscious. The evaluation and history-taking process bring you to conscious dysfunction. Well, Brett, it's really obvious your ankle's locked up and I don't know what's going on with your core, but I think the two things are connected. You're conscious of it, you can't do anything about it. Conscious function means we mobilize your ankle, we get you doing some things, we take you back to rolling. Subconscious function is the state of humans, because I'm not saying you're going to hit a golf ball and not be conscious of it. But you and I walked around all morning talking and we weren't thinking about where our feet were going. And that's the whole point of that. If one of us had to duck under a tree limb or the paddleboard jerked in one way, we just respond to it and we keep the conversation going. So our conscious attention was on our words and we let our body do what it does. If you think of the homunculus and the sensory real estate dedicated to your hands and feet, then you will use a balance beam to train the core and hone the intra-abdominal pressure for the situation that's available. A narrow base and a tippy base. And when I was going through my kettlebell training with Pavel, if you want to organize your core better for the load, squeeze the shit out of the kettlebell. I've got sensory real estate dedicated to my hands. So your hands and feet are well positioned neurologically and in the environment to tell your core exactly what's coming and exactly what to do. And so at some point, we do have to go in here to these people and wake up that cortical map. I got to point at your abs. I got to make you do those pressure things. But if I can't ever take the conversation from this back to organize your hands and feet and watch what your core does, everything it's supposed to.
Right.
So we use a lot of balance beams. We do a lot of stuff with throwing and catching simply to basically say, believe it or not, we do enough with your hands and feet, your core is going to figure out how to do it as long as the neural network is connected and we don't have biomechanical bad hinges in between. But let your hands and feet feed your core once you get it off malnutrition.
Well, I mean, a lot of people want to know too, so including our patients and our students, why does this mechanism get disturbed? And it can get disturbed for a lot of reasons. One, we sit down for the first 20 years of our life. We're told that the right position of the abdominal wall is to suck our stomach in, which once you do that, everything...
It's the right position at the beach, and we all know it. It's not the right position, but it's the right position at the beach, and we've all done it. But let me give you a simple example, and I'm just going to bring this full circle, old country boy. As you go back through Danville today, there's a Wendy's. And if you went through the drive-thru...
Baconator?
Yeah. If you went through the drive-thru and got 3 of their Wendy's chilies, and you did the jalapenos, and maybe there's a little Texas Pete there too. You get those chilies down. The one thing I can tell you today's not is squat day. You do not want to be back squat loaded an hour or two after eating 1 or 2 or 3 servings of Wendy's chili. Now, what am I actually saying? Your gut has a more important job right now than knocking down some back squats.
Right.
Your gut is basically processing a very insulting meal and not trying to make a mistake for you. So my point is, there are so many things that can interrupt our core, from an asthmatic attack to seasonal allergies to leaky gut to poor digestion to constipation to diarrhea. So your core's got a lot more important things to do than give you 20 seconds of static single leg stance. It does that on top of balancing your breathing, your digestion, organizing your reciprocal rotation and ambulation and stuff like that. So, I've always said that the best medicine we could practice is remove the negative first. If I'm sitting here smoking a cigarette and drinking a shot of bourbon, asking my nutritionist, should I add some flaxseed to my diet? I would be like, I could help you more by deleting 2 things than adding anything, right? So I don't think sometimes we really protect the situation before we try to correct it. If your kid's in the street, you can spank them when you get them to the front yard, but don't stop in the middle of the street. Now you're both going to get hit by the car. So protection, correction, development. And too many people want to go into the abdominal region with all these instructions and exercises and enlightening things. You haven't protected the situation yet. So I'm one of the few therapists that will actually put my patients back in a back brace, because I would rather let this elastic do it for you and have you breathe against the elastic than you try to figure out where it is. And most of the people I put in back braces aren't back patients. They're neck patients. And they're using their traps for their core because they got one no more. And I'll put a back brace on. I'm like, I don't know, you made my neck feel so much better. You put the brace on my back. I'm like, well, your neck is actually the victim of a poor core and the postures that follow that. So by artificially creating an abdominal wall for you, I can wean you off of this, and they will never know consciously what their abs did wrong. I will just wean them off of the brace and then do single leg stance activities and partial plank activities, a little bit of rolling and crawling. And I'll with some people that have had serious trauma or multiple surgeries, I do have to get all my fingers in there and do a lot of stuff, and we have to do a lot of this stuff, a lot of biofeedback at this place. I would say 60 to 70% of the time I can get your core authentic without having a core discussion with you. And I take that as a challenge. I take it like if I'm a right-handed fighter, I'd like to win left-handed, right? Because if I can win 80% left-handed, I'm about 100% now, because you don't know that's coming. So I like to disadvantage myself and not get into deep discussions about the core, simply because the only people they're good for is the academics. They don't really help my patients.
Right.
So get them on a balance beam, get them into a developmental pattern, let them see how they transition from kneeling to standing and back. And, you know, I can see a core problem when you get up off the floor and get back down on the floor. And in that are many of the exercises you need to practice on your own, you know.
And I think, I mean, that's a good point with the old Wendy's example, as far as like the body's going to do what's more primal. So when we're talking about the abdominal muscles, when given a choice, respiration is more important than stabilization. So that little delicate balance, I think, is really fragile. And it's because the body's always going to get air into our lungs when given a choice. So then what gets compromised is a stabilization. And then, you know, sometimes we need to stabilize ourselves. If we're going to squat right now, well, I'm going to do a Valsalva. I'm going to close my glottis and, you know, get a big old brace and it'll be over with. But if I gave you, you know, an 80-pound kettlebell and told you to walk over to Wendy's across the street, that's a different situation because you have to breathe as you're keeping yourself stable. And in my opinion, I feel like that's where a lot of our patients and athletes, that's where they're not good. They know how to brace themselves for a one-time episode. Mm-hmm. They're not good at stabilizing their back over a period of time. And if you think about it, that's what we're doing on the athletic field. That's what we're doing in our lives. And I think that gets
I'm glad you brought that up because when I sort of dipped my toe into trying to come up with a screen for conditioning like we did for movement, I didn't try to isolate or demonstrate core competence. I just said, if you can't carry 75% of your body weight split into two hands for a minute to 90 seconds, you do not have postural integrity under load. Simple as that.
Right.
So, you know, if you look at every lifting culture that has ever created impressive specimens, they didn't stop doing carries. Okay? So we as humans do lift things and we do carry things, and we actually carry things more than we lift things, right? And what do we carry? The things that are valuable to us. We carry our kids, we carry our food, we carry our weapons, and we carry our tools. We carry.
Right.
And so when we're trying to become strong, it's so easy to get pulled into a conversation of lifting. No. I tell you what, I grew up on a farm. We had to break ice in the pond and carry 5-gallon buckets up a hill to the hog pen and stuff like that. You've
barefoot.
You've done farmers carries before you're 15. You get in the weight room, everything's easy because everything's got a organized handle and a pre-selected weight. I mean, hay bales, they're heavy when they're wet. They're not as heavy when they're not wet. I mean, you know, but either way, it's got to be up there. So you learn to manage these obstacles. But I wish people would use the balance beam and the developmental position to get the limb competency and that awareness of core and posture.
That's great, yeah.
And then do a carry. Do your patients have to carry 75%? No, we had to standardize this in fit populations for people not hurt. My point is holding a weight and moving with the weight. We were swinging the bag around and watching the way somebody weight shifts and moves with more of a load imposed than a weight to lift or organize. And we even got these little sandbag yokes now. We just put it over your shoulder. You immediately organize. Just a little bit of weight organizes it a lot better. And so sometimes instead of using verbal cues, we need kinetic cues. And when I'm trying to make kids squat deeper, I don't give them squat exercises. I have them jump and stick the landing. And I've talked about this a lot of times. When they can jump and stick a landing off the first bleacher, I put a beanbag on their head. And I jump and stick the landing and don't drop my beanbag. So now we've got deep squat patterning and spinal organization at the same time. And I never said, but I promise you, the kids that can stick a landing, jumping off the height of their own tibia with a cornhole bag on their head, I'm pretty sure you'd be satisfied their intra-abdominal pressure was right. And so I like to do things that have extrinsic value. I can definitely tell you, even if the beanbag wasn't falling off that kid's head, now you know. You can hear him landing louder. He's flexed forward when he's landing. You know why the beanbag's falling off the head. And the kid who was able to hold it knows everything they had to do it, and that was just enough to land with a soft footprint and an organized spine. And so I try to create these little life lessons where I get to say spinal organization without ever saying that word. but everybody knows what it means.
Yeah. And you gamify it a little bit, right? You make it fun for the kid.
Of course.
Yeah,
it's simply another obstacle, and overcoming that obstacle has the obstacle courses that I created in the 3-year journey that I made myself a PE teacher. My wife and I volunteered to be PE teachers every Thursday for 3 years, right up until COVID. And it was the way we wanted to give back, but every day was just obstacle course day. But I created obstacles that made you do things that had transferable value. So without ever doing corrective exercise or any formal sets and reps of anything, we changed an entire school's movement screen and balance test by doing obstacle courses on Thursdays. That's it. I do know that the obstacle courses we built on Thursdays influenced recess because more kids are playing on balance beams and jump roping correctly. But it was the obstacles that we created and the fact that some kids failed, some kids passed, but every kid was imprinting the others with movement patterns. So I left 5 minutes at the end of every course to talk about lessons. What do we need to do on a balance beam? Well, we don't need to hold our breath, do we? How's that help anything? But some of us hold our breath when we're nervous. So next time you're on the balance beam, if you're one of the ones having difficulty, don't forget to breathe. It's going to be important. And that's all we did. And we transformed the physical culture of a school with physical obstacles and maybe some of the organization and opportunities that come out of that. And it was beautiful to see. So I didn't make any of these kids learn FMS or Gray Cook or physical therapy to move better. But I did everything I talk about to you guys. I just didn't say it to them. And I think some people listen to what people like us say and they talk that way to their patients. No. Just get their patients to move the way we're talking about, but you ain't got to talk about it.
That's a great point. I think what people would like for you to comment on also would be, so if we're looking at FMS, SFMA, Y balance, upper and lower, of those different components, what ones would be looking at abdominal wall function? And I know it's kind of a global approach. However, what are the ones that you pay attention to of the testing?
I know how busy you are when you're practicing and you're already using your own feedback loops. You didn't need me to get your feedback loops. Some people do, but you were already generating probably a better than average result without any technology that I added, okay? The only thing I would add right now, because I think you would be able a month from now give me some feedback, is I'd say, listen, you don't have to drink the Kool-Aid. You don't have to do an SFMA. You don't have to do FMS or anything. Do our motor control screens. It is a literal slide box on an FMS kit. But by doing a single leg stance slide box and a single arm plank reach, you will be able to take a signature of the forces running through here. And sometimes you will reorganize a global pattern, and sometimes you'll just rack and crack their neck. Either way, if you change a balance signature without practicing balance, you've deburdened the central nervous system. So long before you would try to go to FMS sniper school or learn the SFMA from Greg Rose, I would simply say, take our motor control screens, buy an FMS kit and a slide box. Don't do the FMS. Just do the slide box, upper and lower for athletes and at least lower for all patients, okay? And tell me what you see and tell me what you can change. And if you get to something in this that you're having difficulty changing, that's where I want FMS to meet you, because I've been looking at that shit for about 25 years. So I know you're already changing more than most because of the way you practice. But I also know you're going to get to a little bit of a stalemate one time with maybe some of the assets you have. That's where I can help you. So the SFMA top tier is a simple test. It's touch your toes, bend backward, turn to the right, turn to the left, run your neck through some motion, run your arms through some motion, single leg stance, let me see a deep squat. That's all. That's it. And of what happened there, I'm going to want to break out your rotation way more. Why? It wasn't the only one that hurt. It was the one that had the biggest left-right difference. Forward bending hurt, right? So I'm going to break out the one that has a signature attached to it, and I'm also going to break out the one that has a provocation of pain attached to it. I'm not going to chase the pain. I'm going to chase the dysfunction and see if it modulates the pain, knowing very well I got something for that if that is in isolation. But if I change your single leg stance and it also isn't your provocation pattern, I can send you home with this exercise without stirring you up. Because I can exercise you in a non-provocational pattern that still has some work to be done because it's dysfunctional, and I'm not worried about you setting off your low back. I can tell you to avoid flexing, extending behaviors for a few days, but I want you to do a bunch of this stuff for balance. If I change your single leg stance and your forward bending gets better, then your balance was part of that aggregate problem. You can't separate them anymore. But if it's not, if I restore your single leg stance and your forward flexion is still limited and painful, then I know I saw a dysfunction and I cannot blame your forward flexion on that dysfunction. So I'm going to play both, but I would say go back to it. Most of the people who are doing things that would make them listen to this podcast, they're already changing motor control, I think, far better than they're getting credit for. But don't assume you're changing it every time.
And they're not
you want
assessing
to.
it, so they don't know that they're actually making
They're right.
these
They're
changes.
right. So the cool thing about the motor control screens, they're done with your shoes on. So if you're treating somebody, they don't have to take their shoes off like the YBT and stuff. They step right outside your treatment room, slide the box, right? Push the box, slide right back in, and you took a snapshot of their central nervous system state of readiness.
You know, I say sometimes the audit is better for the clinician than it is actually for the patient, just because you start to see all these amazing things we're doing with our patients neurologically that you have no idea unless you're assessing it.
Yeah.
And it almost like makes you excited to go to work the
You
next
don't
day.
have to have
'cause
the
you-
answer. I remember, do you know who Brian Mulligan is?
Yeah,
Mulligan
of course.
was? All right. Well, when Brian was actually teaching Brian Mulligan courses, I was a dumbass in the front row taking them from Brian, and we got drunk a few nights. And he said, it's great because there's always a right answer. When you ask somebody, I do a move, and one of my classics is, all right, is that better, worse, or the same? No matter what they say, Brian goes, I'm going to say, well, of course. It's worse. Of course, because I knew that was the provocation pattern. I was getting a second confirmation. Oh, it's the same. Of course, because I don't think we confronted the problem yet. Oh, it's worse, or it's better. Of course, because that is, So the whole point is I'm not scared about what you're going to say because it's only one of three things if I adjust you. And I'm not just saying an adjustment is a manipulation. If I do something to input your system, I'm going to make you better, I'm going to make you worse, or I'm going to make you the same. If I do an assessment first, I'm never going to be surprised by worse.
Right.
Right? Because I already know what provokes you and I already know what doesn't provoke you. So it's either going to be the same or better. And after doing what we've done for a while, 80% of the time, it's better. It's a little better. It's a lot better. It's somewhat better. But they said it. I didn't. They told me, right? So it was really cool that better, worse, or the same is something I see a lot of people scared to say because they don't want to hear the bad news.
Yeah, they don't want to say
like we should have done a better damn eval. I mean,
So true.
right?
So, that's a really good point. Sometimes God winks at you and you get a softball, and I'm gonna throw you one right now. Could you tell our listeners how a movement screen is also inadvertently checking stabilization? I think people it's so binary in their minds.
Yes.
Either you have stabilization or you have mobility.
Right.
So can you talk about like how those things are actually intertwined together? You've said it numerous times over the last 2 days with us, and I think it's a really, really important point because we may not need another stabilization test because sometimes movement is telling us whether something is stable or not.
You're spot on. If when does a baby get their stabilization? They get a little more each day. I don't think a child truly has full, authentic human stabilization until you see them run at a pretty good clip and maybe climb a tree. And then they've shown you my core can work two different ways, right? I can locomote and I can manipulate. Those are the two things that I do with my body. But I do think test and isolation must be done. I need to fill up the peach basket on this seesaw of reductionistic, dissected information. I don't need to do less of that. I need to do more of this over here. I need to have a holistic movement signature. Why not go back to the moves in the developmental sequence? I'm not going right to pitching. I'm not going right to the golf swing because so many of the things you do in rolling are going to tell me you're going to have a problem there. So many of the things you do in quadruped tell me you're going to have a problem there. I can look at your lunge and know what kind of pitch you're going to do because that tells me something there too. Aristotle said the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. That means that I'm going to measure something different in whole movement than the assimilation of ankle, hip, and knee flexion. A squat is more than flexing the lower extremity. And so I used to do this all the time. I lay you flat on your back, and I take the bottoms of your feet and I shove them way up so your knees are almost on your chin. And I've literally put you in a full deep squat position. You have the mobility to be deep squatting 6 inches below parallel. Stand up and do it, and you can't. So I have seen people that pass both mobility test and a few core stability tests and still can't do a lunge on one side, and still can't squat below parallel, or still can't touch their toes. So if the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, then I'm not saying that you didn't adequately assess the parts. What I'm saying is, did it ever occur to you that the entire orchestra is doing exactly what they're supposed to and the conductor's messed up? Every one of these flutes, wind instruments, percussion, they're all doing exactly what they're supposed to. He's making the bad call. So how many times do we rush over to the wind section? We got to work on that. We rush over to the percussion section. No, you got a bad conductor today. And what did we learn when we started doing studies in the military with the movement screen? Sleep deprivation and dehydration will take away your whole movement signature. Had I not known that, I was getting ready to dispense an exercise to that guy to recalibrate his movement. So whole movement will tell you things that your other test didn't tell you. I'm not saying don't do the other test, right? Look at a shoulder pattern, clear the shoulder joint. Look at a neck pattern, don't forget the clavicle. So I'm doing both, but at some point, if I don't restore a classic humanoid movement pattern to you, then I haven't done it all.
Right.
So that last bit of stability that's purely subconscious can only be measured in a whole pattern, because you're not asking me to tension or balance or do anything. You're asking me to move. And I did. And I didn't think about it first. When you talk to an NBA player about a layup, he's got a motor program that says layup. He just hits that button. It's not dribble, step, jump.
Right.
It's not the first time he did it, it was. And that's the same way about squat. People who are in Brazilian martial arts will go into a squat, a sweep, a lunge, a roll. They can't even tell you what they're going to do, and they go through that fluid movement so well that it's effortless. It's like, how does a cat always know to land on his feet? It never considered any other option. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So
I don't think we even talked about, so when we decided to name our company, it's Gestalt Education. Mm-hmm. It's basically Aristotle's quote. Basically, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And what we mean by that is, and I think it's a perfect way to wrap this up, you can be good at DNS, you can be good at dry kneeling, you can be good at manipulation, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to integrate these together. And I think what I really respect you, Gray, is you're not telling people, well, this is exactly the way that you need to do it. You're basically just saying, this is the way that we're going to assess the patient, and we can all get in an agreement on that. I think you made a great point this morning as far as like specialized medicine. Like in our world, none of us are speaking a similar language, which is making it really hard for us to communicate with each other. So I want to pay you a compliment, because I think like you were smart to not say, well, this is exactly the way that we're going to do it. But what you're saying is this is a global language that we can assess our patients, and then we can fight till the cows come home on like how we're going to do that and get snobby about it. But I think that's the beauty of your system.
Well, no, I appreciate that, and I take that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts very seriously. And when I looked at my profession, our collective profession, when I looked at everybody who's influencing musculoskeletal movement, we have heavy investment in dissection, reductionism, and selling procedures. We don't have heavy investment in prevention and full restoration. Right. We don't. It's never even occurred to us that a healthcare model shouldn't create dependence. And I don't. If you had a college and never graduated anybody, I really wouldn't want to go there. But I know a lot of rehab situations that don't even consider graduating. They're a patient for life. No, I would say a client for life, a patient in the temporary episodes when I need to take control of your neurological system and then hand it back to you. but I'd like you to run on autopilot as long as you can. I'll have enough patience. Don't you worry about my bottom line. But I really think that if the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, then why aren't we measuring both? And that's what FMS means, measure the whole. It doesn't mean that we don't prize manual therapy and PRP and dry needling and even admit that surgery is the thing you need right now. It means if it is not hopefully an attainment of the whole, then you really don't get credit for good goniometry. Really, you can look great on the goniometer, right? You look great on a strength test. No, people, they like gold medals, they like NFL rings, and so if we're serious about Aristotle's statement, we must measure the whole. We must measure the parts. We must realize if the whole is broken and the parts are broken, it's obvious. We don't even have an orchestra here. How are we going to get music? But once the orchestra is pretty well handled, you're still not getting music. I'd worry about the conductor. And that's where we get back into the neuro. And that's what the human brain does. All those sensory inputs that you were talking about, they're not in play when you're doing a side plank. You're simply demonstrating your core is not broken when you do a side plank. But you're not demonstrating that your core will be authentic on a balance beam.
Right.
So we need to do both tests.
And you need variety. I mean, there's never been the same exact situation on an athletic field ever because the ball's in a different place, your teammates in a different place. So we got to watch that we're not just training in one particular, move or exercise. We need to be adding variety consistently because that's actually what's happening on the athletic field.
Yeah, no, and that's why I do try to gamify the corrective process.
Right.
The one thing that I think we do a little bit better, and I think people don't understand it, I make runners quit running for a little while. I make kickers quit kicking for a few minutes. I make pitchers quit pitching for a few minutes. And I simply say, the things that your compensations have become part of this skill signature. If we don't back off, you will continue to perpetuate the problem because it's the only way you throw. So a lot of runners don't like it when I say you got to back off running. I didn't say you're going to do elliptical. It's got that movement pattern. You're reinforcing it right here. So I always probably am more hyper vigilant about protecting the situation before I correct it. You get the soil ready and then drop the seed. Right? If I've got grass this tall, I'm not dropping tomato seeds in it. Right? I'm going to get the soil ready. And so I do spend a lot of time seeing how many of these toxic behaviors can you help me mitigate before we try to start correcting the situation. And if I got somebody who's very married to their toxic behaviors, I'll tell them very quickly, I don't know if I'm going to have much influence here. I think you're doing about as good as you can do doing what you're doing.
Right.
I wouldn't expect to feel a bit better than you do doing what you're doing. So, but if you can quit doing 3 of these things and then we can change 2 more, I think we're doing fine.
Beautiful. What a great ending to the last 3 days. Gray, we're forever indebted to you. We really appreciate you. I can't even explain how much I've learned. I can't wait to go back through and listen to these. And your gold medal is human connection. I mean, you find a way to connect with people around you, and I'm just very appreciative. So,
thank you, bud.
Thanks, Gray.
Thank you
appreciate
very much.
you. Yeah.
I think too. I mean, I would close this with. I mean, I think when I always tell the story of the continuum of what we know about low back stabilization. And I always start with Punjabi's original paper because he exposed the importance of us being able to feel our bodies really well, the receptor system, and how that actually affects us to be able to stabilize. Paul Hodges came on and educated us on the transverse abdominis and multifidus, and that this was a motor control problem. Dr. Stu McGill let us know when we should be using a brace and that we probably shouldn't be holding our abdominal wall in. Pavel Kolaj taught us the second function of the diaphragm, which is postural stabilization. It's not only respiration. And to his credit, people were talking about it, but Pavel Kolaj was the first one to really start to expose that idea. And I think let's put Gray Cook in there. Let's put Gray Cook in explaining the importance of being able to move our bodies and our joints well, which is going to give our brain the better opportunity to stabilize our abdominal wall.
Absolutely.
So I
Absolutely.
think, yeah.
No, thank you, man. Yeah.
Awesome. What a great final thoughts. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Guys, stay tuned for more.
All right.